everyone, Annette from Sheridan Art and Designs. Today we're going to introduce a new series of videos that we're creating called Stash Busters. Stash Buster projects are designed to be simple 1 or 2 day projects that utilize items from what you already have in your stash. Don't have a stash? We'll give you tips on how to build your stash with opportunistic purchases, buying strategically, and what are those basics to always have on hand. The idea behind the Stash Buster series is that you don't always have to go buy new for a project. Oftentimes, we have most, if not all of what we need to create a project, even if we have to think a little creatively to make it work. Today's Stash Buster is Dementor in a Day. This is a great project for a last-minute Halloween costume or decoration, especially if you're a Harry Potter fan. Let's get started.
One of the first things that I do when I begin a project, especially a Stash Buster project, is I like to gather up all the things that I have. Let me see what I've got to work with, and then I can really make some decisions and audition different fabrics with things to decide what I'm going to do going forward. So for the Dementor, I happen to have these 2 patterns, and either one of them would work. Basically what we're looking for is a robe with a hood. That's all we really need, is a basic robe with hood. It's really nice if it already has a belled sleeve like both of these patterns do. Have a nice wide belled sleeve. That's also a really nice thing to have. So of these 2 patterns, like I said, they would both work. Because I happen to be a Harry Potter fan, I'm going to go with the Harry Potter pattern. And the other reason why I want to go with this one is because I want to show you that even though this robe is cut off just below the knees and it's a house robe, you can take this same pattern and with just a couple of simple alterations, make it into a Dementor. So you're not having to buy 2 different patterns. You can take this pattern and make it a Dementor as well. So we'll be using this pattern, and then I've collected up some of the things that are in my stash, different fabrics. Some of these actually I cannibalized from Halloween decorations, and and just things that I saw that I thought, like this one in particular, I saw at the fabric store when they had Halloween fabrics on sale, and I thought, that would be perfect for like a mummy or something. And it's a little bit light and gray for a Dementor, but I'm going to layer a black gauze over the top of it, which I'll talk about in just a second, which will make it work really nicely. The reason why I liked this fabric was because it's already distressed. It's already shredded, and it's got, a mottled black, gray, dark gray, light gray coloring to it. So it's kind of perfect for that Dementor, or kind of anything Halloween-y actually. Then I also found some black, this is a really lovely soft black tulle, but it's really sheer, and so it will give a very ethereal look. And so I very likely will use this if I gather it up. You have multiple layers of it. It's not quite so sheer, and it does give you this kind of smoky, ethereal feel to it. So I'll probably use that to drape off the bottom of it to make it look like those the shredded hems of the robe, and probably off the sleeves as well. So we're gonna use that. And then I found, this was actually in the Halloween decorations section. I bought at least a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. And this is just black, it's a wide weave black gauze. And you can see it's already pre-distressed. It's got rips and tears and all kinds of lovely distressing to it, which I don't have to do, which is great. So that will also get used. And then I found this as well, my stash. This is also one of those, I bought this a year or two ago, same time I bought the black gauze, that it kind of has that raggedy, pre-distressed look to it. So I'll be using that for likely the hood and the shoulders, kind of making a cowl over the shoulders kind of thing. And then because all of these fabrics, especially this one, which I'm going to use for the base of my fabric, you can see it's kind of see-through. So I'm actually using just a plain black cotton. You can get this in the quilter's cotton. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or expensive. You can see mine is very, very lightweight. It's a Kona cotton, very inexpensive. And I'm just going to layer that right underneath, and that takes away all of that sheerness. So I'll be talking about flatlining that as well. So I'm using the black cotton to flatline my main pieces and using the other stuff for decoration. Some of the other things that we'll be using is some kind of closure. Now I'm opting not to put a zipper down the front of the robe, just because I think it would be distracting, but we do want the front of the robe to close. So I will likely use these hook and eyes. I found some nice large ones. You can use Velcro, you can use snaps. You can choose not to close it and just wear black clothing underneath. All of those things work. And then the last thing that you'll need is, I just cannibalized an old wire hanger, actually. That's what that used to look like. And just cut it off and straightened it out. And that's going to be for going around the front of the hood. We're going to make a casing around the front of the hood and put that wire in there, and that will help that hood to stand up and go forward right over your head and face, so that the nice soft fabric isn't just laying limply. It will give it some structure. So that's all the things that you need. Some of the first things you need to do are things that I've kind of talked about, which are, decide on your choice of fabrics. Lay out what you have and choose what you want to use. Dementors are kind of decaying, scary, creepy creatures, and so you want to have fabrics that kind of reflect that. A couple of other things that you need to think about is, if you're going to use this pattern, there is a pocket for the robe, and you can choose to include or eliminate the pocket. I am not going to have my Dementor have pockets, so that's my choice. If you're going to include the pocket, you want to have the pocket in the costume, then just simply follow the instructions in the pattern. It's very simple to do. Let's see. Some of the other things that we'll be doing is that when you're cutting out your fabrics, if you're going to be flatlining or underlining, like I'm going to be doing with a base fabric, with a black base fabric, and then layering that over the top, you only need to cut the back and front facings out of the underlining fabric. You don't need to cut it out of the top self fabric. And that will help eliminate bulk at those seam lines and junctures, and it will give you just that nice black finished edge on the inside. So that's that. And and the other thing that you can do as an option is you can, this particular robe has a seam down the center back, and this pattern happens to have a very straight center back, as most do and should. I chose to cut that on the fold, and the reason why I did that was because I didn't want my Dementor to have a big seam. down the back. So you can certainly do that. Just follow the instructions in the pattern. You would just simply flatline the separate pieces and then do the center seam down the back. Very easy to do. So either way works, just up to you. All right, so let me get this all cleared away and we'll get started with flatlining the front and back sections and doing some stay stitching on the neckline. All right, before we jump into cutting out all our pieces and flatlining, I wanted to just pause for a moment and talk about some adjustments to the pattern. If you're going to be using this pattern for a Dementor, then there's 3 things you need to think about. The first one is adding length to the robe so that it hits, bring it down to the floor or just above the floor, whatever your desired length is, because this robe is short and we don't want our legs showing as a Dementor. The second thing is whether or not to do the pocket. There is a side seam pocket on this, so you can opt to skip the pocket like I'm doing, or you can opt to put it in. If you put it in, just follow the directions on the pattern. And the third thing is the center back seam. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to cut mine out on the fold so that I don't have a center back seam. That's just purely an aesthetic choice that I'm doing. You certainly can do the center back seam, but if you choose to cut it on the fold like I'm doing and eliminating the center back seam, make sure that you place the pattern, make sure the seam allowance of the pattern is off the edge of the fold of the material so that you're placing the actual seam line, the stitching line on the fold of the fabric. And that will make sure that the hood fits appropriately. If you just put the edge of the pattern that includes the seam allowance on the fold, then you'll actually end up with 1.25 inches too much in the neckline and your hood won't fit properly. So just make sure that you're, if you are eliminating that center back seam, that you're putting the stitch line on the fold, not the edge of the pattern, not the cut line. All right, let's get started. The first step in this project really is to stay stitch the neckline of both the fronts and the back pieces. But I need to, as I said earlier, is that I need to flatline my material because my material is very sheer. So I'm flatlining it with a black. Now, if you have not heard the term flatlining, all that means is that I'm going to treat this black fabric becomes what we call an underlining, and that underlining is different from a regular lining. So a regular lining is constructed separately from the garment and then the two are put together. An underlining is a fabric that actually gets stitched to the self fabric or your top fabric and by each piece. And then from then on, once it's basted down to the self fabric, the 2 pieces of fabric are treated as a single piece from then on. So lining is when you construct the two garments and then put them together. An underlining or flatlining is when you mount your self fabric onto a lining so that you've cut all of the same pieces out of the lining fabric and you're now mounting each piece separately onto the underlining bit. So that's the first step that I need to do. So I'm going to pin this down and you can see I've lined it all up, and I'll just be pinning this down and take it over to the machine, and I'm just going to baste inside. So it's actually inside the seam allowance, so not on the seam line, but just, you know, 1/4 inch off the edge all the way around. And then while I'm there, I will do the stay stitching, and this pattern happens to call for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'll be doing that stay stitching on the neckline, on both of the fronts and the back. All right, so we have all of our pieces cut out of all of our different fabrics. So you can see here, this is a sleeve that I've cut out of that raggedy Halloween fabric. And I've gone ahead and flatlined this so you can see what it looks like. And so what I did was I cut one out of my black cotton underlining fabric and one out of the fashion fabric that I'm using on top. And then I simply ran a basting stitch on my machine, 3.5 millimeter basting stitch, about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, so inside the seam allowance. And I ran that all the way around the entire sleeve piece. And then you can also see where I've transferred my pattern markings to the underlining piece, not to the fashion fabric, because you won't be able to see them after you put the underlining on. So don't forget to transfer your markings there as well. And then I've done the same thing. This happens to be one of the fronts of the robe, and I'm using that kind of mummy-like fabric for this. And again, cut one out of the black cotton, one out of the fashion fabric, and then flatlined it all the way around, the same as I did the sleeve. Then the additional step that I did, which is the first step in the pattern, is to stay stitch the neckline, and I did that for both fronts and the back. The next step is to go ahead and start putting the robe together. So we're going to stitch the shoulder seam to the front to the back at the shoulder seam and at this long side seam here. So we're going to go ahead and do that to stitch both fronts to the back at the shoulder and side seams. Okay, we've got our long seams stitched and our shoulder seams stitched, and you can see I've already gone ahead and pinked the edge of that seam, and then I'll press that open so it's ready for the next step. And then I'm going to do the same thing here, just going to take my pinking shears and get this flipped over, and I'm not taking off very much, just trimming down to about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And because I've got, you know, different kinds of fabric in there, I've got a polyester and a cotton, some are raveling, some are not, I decided just to clean up our seam allowances, trim them down, and pink them all in one step so that everything's neat and tidy, things won't unravel on us, and we won't have big bulky seams, especially since I've got 4 layers of fabric there between that gray distressed fabric and the black underlining cotton. So eliminating bulk where we can. So because this Dementor, we don't have to worry about fit too much. The things that we're going to want to make sure we have taken care of in terms of fit are, is it long enough? And is it big and flowy enough? We do not want this to be a fitted robe. We want it to be loose and flowy and very ethereal. So ethereal in kind of a grim, more gothic kind of way. Okay, I'm going to go off and press my seams open just like this. So everything will be pinked and pressed open, and then we will set in the sleeves would be next. All right, so we have our robe constructed. So the back is stitched to the two fronts at the shoulder and the side seams, and so then the next step, I've got that hanging on the dress form out of the way for the moment. And then the next step is to take our sleeve. So this is our sleeve, and we're going to stitch the long underarm seam. We're going to do two things while we're working here. The first is just fold the sleeve right sides together and match your ends and your notches, and we're going to stitch this long underarm seam, and then we'll treat that the same as we did the side seams and the shoulder seams. Pink it and press it open to eliminate any excess bulk. And then down here, while we are working on the sleeve, after we've got this underarm seam taken care of, then we will press up the hem on this, and we're going to start here at this pointed edge here. We're going to start and stop here at the point, and we're just going to press up that seam or the hem, press it up and stitch it down, and then that will be ready to be set into the robe. All right, so we have both of our sleeves constructed. So we have the underarms seam stitched, pinked, and pressed open, and I have done a narrow rolled hem, pressed that up and stitched it down. So the sleeve is done and it's ready to be set into the robe. So we need the sleeve to be right side out, and on the robe we're actually going to bring that wrong side out because we're going to be working right sides together. So here's the armhole, and I'm just going to tuck the sleeve right up inside the jacket, or the robe rather, and we are taking the underarm seam, right side of the robe with that underarm seam right there, and we're just going to match those two seams right up. Okay, so we have our underarm and our side seams matched. And that in place. And then we'll move to the left and to the right and just match up those notches and pin those in place. And then we're going to work our way around the sleeve, easing in the fullness. And what I like to do is I like to go straight across. So from my underarm seam here to the top of the sleeve, and you can see my circle is marked there. That circle is going to go right, line up right with the shoulder seam. Okay, and we'll pin that in place. So now we know the sleeve will be oriented correctly into the armhole. And now it's just a matter of going around and pinning right sides together, the edge of the armhole, setting that sleeve right in. And as you get to the top, there's going to be it's going to be a little extra fullness here. And you can run a gathering stitch across the head of the sleeve if you like, or you can just ease it in. It's really not that much. As you line up those raw edges, it eases in pretty nicely. So either method works. Matching up those circles. Okay, and now that we have that pinned in place, before we go to the machine, I just want to show you one last thing, is that we're going to stitch this all the way around the armhole, and then before we leave the machine, we're going to take another about 1/8 of an inch in towards the seam allowance. We're going to stitch again from the single notch to the double notch. So just that's another 1/8 of an inch, just another row of stitching there, and then we'll clip the armhole down. Okay, so we have our sleeve stitched in, and you can see I have that second row of stitching right between the two notches there. And we are going to take our sharp snips and just clip up to that, but not through, just kind of close to that stitching, about 1/8 of an inch away, and we're going to just trim this excess fabric down between the notches, just like that. And then I'm going to take my pinking shears and just trim the rest of this armhole down just a little bit, not very much. Just cleaning up the edges and making sure there's no extra unnecessary bulk there. All right, and then you can press the seam allowance toward the armhole, and then we pull that out. And this is going to look funny at the moment because I've got these two different fabrics, but I promise it'll come together. So this is our robe with the front and our sleeve. Okay, so now it's time to start draping some of all of the extra fabrics that I had, the gauze and that nice ethereal tulle. So I'm going to put this on the dress form, and then I'm going to start draping the overlay fabrics onto the robe. Okay, so it's time to do the fun stuff now. This is, we're just going to take, as you can see, I have that distressed gauze that I had at the beginning, and this is going to be my first layer that I put on over the top of the base robe. And you can see I have it on the dress form, and I have lined up the neckline here, and I've pinned that center front down so that I won't be stretching it and pulling it out of play. So now it's just about taking what we have and looking at it and kind of saying, okay, this is a nice straight long edge. Let's start draping it and see what it looks like. right, so after you have the robe draped with all of your spooky goodness fabric, the next thing to do is to construct the hood and the hood lining and the facings. So we have 2 front facings and a back facing. So let's talk about the hood first. You can see I've already put the lining together. So I've stitched it right sides together all along this edge, so you have a nice point there, and then that's the right side, and I've pinked and pressed open the seam. We're going to do the same thing with the hood. Now we're not flat lining the hood like we did the rest of the garment. We are actually just going to line it because we want the inside of the hood, we don't want that open seam in the inside of the hood. So we're actually going to line the hood as opposed to flat lining it. And we're just going to right sides together, pin the 2 hood pieces together, and we're going to stitch on this notched edge from the neckline all the way up to the point and then across to the front. Leave the front open. We're not stitching there yet. And then once you have that done, the next thing while you're at the machine, you might as well stitch the front and back facing together, because we will line the hood, attach the hood to the robe, and then lay the facing on top of it. All right, it's ready to go. And then we have our 2 facings. So these facings will go right on, so you'll have the robe, and then you'll have the hood, and then this facing will go over the top of it, and then we'll turn the facing to the inside so you have a nice clean finish on your opening and at your neckline. So the facings are fairly easy to do. Just taking right sides together, and the first thing we're going to do is stitch them at the shoulder seam. So the neckline goes to the neckline, and we have the long straight edge there. So laying your facings out, it's going to look like this, and then our other one will look like this. So we'll just stitch these together at the shoulder. And then after you have that done, the next step would be to finish the edge of the facing. That's not going to get stitched to the robe, but the one that's going to get turned to the inside, so that we have a clean finished edge on the inside. So we'll stitch the shoulder seams together, and then this edge will get stitched down to the front of the robe. And so on the opposite edge is where we will want to, at this point you can either hem this separately or incorporate it into the hem of your robe, or if you can also choose not to hem the robe, in which case I would turn up the end of the facing. But then we're just going to press under 1/2 inch seam allowance, 1/2 inch, 5/8, whatever your pattern calls for, and all the way around the front, the back, and the front on this outer curved edge. is where we're turning that under and stitch it down so that we have a nice finished edge there. All right, we have both of our hoods constructed, and I've also prepared the facing, so that's ready to go when we need that in the next step. So the next step is to line the hood. So we are going to do that by putting right sides together. So turn my lining hood right side out, and I'll leave the fabric, the fashion fabric hood, inside out. All right, so that one's right side out, and then this one. So then all we need to do is put right sides together. So I'm just going to take the point of that and put it right up into the point of this hood so that everything is lined up. And just match up these front center seams. Make sure everything's lying nice and flat in there. Okay. Now we're just going to stitch this front seam here. So from this edge all the way around to this edge. And we're actually going to do that twice. I know the pattern only says to do it once, but we are going to do it once at the seam allowance of 5/8, and then we're going to do it again at 1/4 of an inch, and that will allow us to have 3/8 of an inch casing to put the wire through in order for the hood to stand up and to. Now, if you want your hood to be more, drapey, then you can skip the wire step and just stitch this at the 5/8 mark, and you'll be good to go for the next step. Just making sure that these center seams are lined up, and then I'll finish pinning that all the way around and stitch this opening. Now when we are stitching it again, we're going to stitch it at 5/8 of an inch, and again at just 1/4 of an inch off the edge. So that'll leave us a 3/8 inch gap in between the two stitching lines, which will create a casing for us to put the wire through. I was at the sewing machine, and the light bulb went on for me that I thought this would be a fantastic time to show you how to do some understitching, and it's a great method in particular to make this casing. So you can see I've started stitching it a little bit just so that I can show you what it would look like. So understitching, you can see I've done my seam all the way across the front at the 5/8 seam allowance, and now it's time to make that casing. And I was getting ready to do the second row of stitching, and I thought, understitching is a fantastic technique that will actually, especially when you're doing facings or linings, if you understitch the seam allowance to the lining or the facing, the inside fabric, whichever it happens to be, if it's a full lining or a facing. but you don't stitch it down to your fashion fabric. So it requires you to open it up like I have here and lay it flat, and then the seam allowance gets pressed over to one side, and then you can see, hopefully you can see, where I have run the second row of stitching, and that is stitching only on my lining. It is not on my fashion fabric at all. What this will allow us to do is it will do two things for us all at once, which is great. One step doing two things. So once I have the understitching done, I can take my wire and put my wire right into that casing. Now watch what happens when I roll it over. We will of course have this all the way through, but I just wanted to show you this quickly. So what happens is now we have this wonderful structure that we can bend and drape and do whatever we want with it inside the front of the hood, but without showing any stitching on the outside. So it it really hides that casing very well, and then you can barely see the stitching on the inside, but that's where that's how you create that casing. So again, one last time, I'll go back and finish all of this. I just wanted to show you. So you lay your fabric, get this back around the way it was. All right, so we have our fashion fabric, the outer hood to the right, we have our lining hood to the left, and I have just kind of finger pressed the seam allowance, both sides of the seam allowance, all the way over to the lining side, and then I'm just going to stitch, and I'm doing, I'm leaving 3/4 to 3/8 of an inch, so just putting the edge of my presser foot on my stitch line, and then that's about 3/8 of an inch on my machine, and then stitching this seam allowance down to the lining only, and then that will create that casing, and it creates this lovely roll. So the fabric will automatically want to roll, the lining fabric will automatically want to roll to the inside, so you don't have your lining doing, sometimes I'm sure you've seen them where the lining peeks through and you can see the lining. That's how you stop from that happening, is you understitch the seam allowance to the lining or to the facing, and you get that beautiful roll with no lining coming up. The lining will never peek through or wrap around, and everything will lay nice and flat. All right, so we have our all of our draping done, and what I did after I had it all pinned in place, I just took a needle and thread and ran a basting stitch around the neckline and down the front, both sides of the front, just to tack it all into place. And then if there were any pieces, like I draped some pieces off the back, and I just hand stitched those into place and took care of that while it was on the dress form, so it was much easier to handle, and everything, nothing was going to shift. So all of that is done. Now we're getting close to being finished, actually. The next step is to just take your snips and to clip the neck edge. And I'm going to do this with the lining facing up so that I can see where my edges are. I've got a little bit of my draping came up over the neckline, so I'll just trim that off. And then we're going to clip these curves so that just to the stay stitching that we did. So there's my stay stitching right there. And we're just going to clip the curve so that when we open it up and we put the hood on it, it will lay nice and flat. And you go close to the stay stitching, but not, don't cut through the stitching. So just putting in a little snip, it's a little clip, so that it will open up and flat. That curve just opens up nice and flat in doing that. So we're going to do that all the way around the neckline. And then we will baste the hood on. And then after we have that in place, we will put the facing on, and that's the very last step. I'm going to leave my hemline kind of hanging and raggedy. That's how I've draped it. But that's up to you. You can certainly hem the bottom or leave it ragged. I kind of like the ragged look myself, but it's personal preference, you know, do you? That's one of the great things about designing and making your own things, is that you get to do it your way, you know? Really just be creative and do what makes you happy. Put another one here. Just making sure I'm getting through all of those layers of fashion fabric that I draped over the top. Got my hand underneath there just to make sure that I'm not cutting any pieces of the robe that might be laying under there. Got my hand guiding my scissors exactly where I want to cut. Cut off some of this bulk. Okay, so let's do one last one here. So now you can see that curved neckline opens up nice and flat, that we've nice and straight now that we've clipped it. All right, so then we just take our hoods. We're going to take right sides together. This is our neckline. This is my center back right here, and this is my hood. And you can see I've done the understitching and made the casing there. That's the stitch line right there. I know that's hard to see. And we're just going to take the center seam of the hood, the back of the hood there, that center seam, make sure those are lined up. And we're going to do right sides together with the center back. Turn this around. So my center back of my robe is here, and the center back seam of the hood is there. And we're just going to pin that in place, and I'm going to pin it all the way around, and then I'll baste it. And for this, I'll probably baste it inside the stitch line, so maybe at 3/8 or 1/2 inch. This pattern calls for a 5/8 seam allowance, so inside that 5/8 seam allowance, because then I'll put the facing over the top, and then we'll stitch it all down together. So I'll get this pinned down and we'll be back to, we'll pin it, baste it, and then we'll be back to put the facing on. All right, so we have basted our hood to the robe at the neckline, and got that all basted down in place. And I ran my basting thread inside the seam allowance, so I'll actually stitch here at the 5/8, but it's just easier to remove the basting threads if you put them into the seam allowance. And now we've prepared our facing, and so this is the back facing and the two front facings, and we've got them stitched together at the shoulder seams, the interfacing applied on the wrong side, and then we've turned up and stitched down and finished this outer edge. So it's all ready to go, it's ready to be applied. So we will do the same thing that we did with the hood, matching up those center backs and your notches. You've got notches there. So we're going to match those up. And I just like to kind of finger press a crease down the middle of it. It allows for me to find that center back very quickly. And here's my center back hood seam. So just matching all of those up, center back and notches all get lined up. And then we're going to pin this just like we did the hood all the way around the neckline, all the way down the front opening and down to the hemline. So that's, we're going to pin it all the way around. And then once that's pinned, we'll stitch it at the seam allowance. If your pattern, this one calls for 5/8, but your pattern might call for a different seam allowance, go ahead and stitch that down and around. And we'll be back here to, after all that's done, to clip the curves and insert the wire into the hood and finish things up. So as you go around this curve, you just want to ease that facing, and then after it's stitched, we'll clip that so it'll relax a bit. All right, I'm going to continue on getting this pinned, and we'll be back after it's stitched. All right, so we have the neckline stitched all the way around, all the way down the front to the hem on both sides and the neckline. So now we're just going to take our scissors and we're going to clip the curves on this neckline. And I'm also, because I have, you can see I have 4 layers of fabric here, so I'm actually going to grade those that seam down so it will lay, it won't have this big bulk there. So when you grade a seam, you take the longest one, which is going to be my facing, and then each layer on top of that you cut slightly shorter. So I'm going to leave my facing the longest, and then these other layers I'm just going to cut in different widths, and I'm not going through my seam, my stitching, just trimming off some of this so that I can reduce some of this bulk that's there. And if you grade your seams, so grading is different than trimming them. So trimming, you would cut all layers the same. Grading them, you leave one long and then the next one would be shorter. And that allows for the bulk of the seam of the fabric to be dispersed over the whole area, as opposed to just one place where all the fabric gets cut off and it's a bit of a ridge there. So when you have thick seams like this, where you've got multiple layers, grading them is actually a really good technique to reduce the bulk and get that to lay nice and flat. And then after I've graded a section, I'll come back and I'm going to clip those curves as well. So I'm trimming that top layer down to about 1/4 inch. And then the base layers I'll trim about 1/8 inch off. So that will remain down to about 1/2 to 3/8 inch. So you can see that this is the top layer, and then the second layer is there. So different, the seam allowances are layered. This is the best way to put it. And then I'm just going to trim that corner off while I'm here. So I'm going to do this all the way around, getting my seams trimmed down. And then once I've done that, I'm going to clip these curves just like we did initially. We're just going to go back in and clip those curves because we're the facing on it now. So we want to make sure that those curves can open up and lay nice and flat and straight. And again, clipping close to the stitching, but not through it. And then once we have that done, then the facing is turned to the inside of the robe, like this. We only have 2 more things to do after this. So make sure you get your that corner, get a nice crisp turn on that corner. And then give this a good press. So you want to give this a good press. And once you've pressed it, you just come and we're going to tack the, you have a choice at this point. You can hand stitch down the facing to the robe all the way around, or you can tack it in certain spots if you don't want to do that much hand stitching. You can certainly just tack it at the shoulder seams, and then in a few spots down each front. And certainly I would do the center back as well, where that hood is. Because this curve will lay across the shoulders, I would stitch this whole thing down. All right, so I'm going to finish clipping off all of my seams and trimming everything down and turning it, and be back to stitch down that facing. And then we just put the wire into the hood, and I'm going to put some hook and eyes on the very front to close it off, and then the Dementor robe will be done. All right, so we have finished off our facings, and I understitched. This is a great place to understitch, just like we did on the hood. I did that on the front facings as well, so hopefully you can see that that's where my understitching is, right there. So that's stitch line, and it does not go through to the top. There's no stitching on the top. We just stitched the seam allowance to the facing, and I did that before I turned and pressed it and trimmed it. And that just gives that really beautiful just roll. It rolls the facing right to the inside, and you don't have any problems with that facing kind of rolling up to the top. So that will drape very nicely. And then we finished off the back facing. I've whip stitched that down. So that's finished off nicely. And now we just need to put the wire in the hood and some hook and eyes down the front. So as you can see, I'm just going to make a small snip right here right where that casing is. So this is the stitching that we did, and that's the edge. So that's the casing we made. And just made a tiny snip there. We are going to hand stitch that closed, and just enough to get, do the other end, to get the wire in there. And I'm just using a coat, an old wire coat hanger that I straightened out. It's just about the right thickness to support the weight of the fabric and give you some shape on the edge of that hood if you want. You might want the hood really drapey, and that's okay too. So I'm just going to continue. All right, so now I'm all the way down around to, oh no, I'm only halfway. Gotta get through this seam. Open up that seam allowance and get the wire in there. All right, and then we just continue to push that wire all the way through that casing in the front of the hood that we did earlier. Until it reaches the end here. Okay, and then now I'm just taking, and this is the end where we put it in, and I'm just tucking it in, straightening it out a little bit and pushing it down to the end there. And then I will just take my needle and thread and slip stitch that shut, and hold the wire in place there. And there we go. There's our hood. Hard to see. Let me see if I can zoom out a little bit. Okay, so there's our hood with the wire in it. All right, let's get this up on the dress form, and then we can just measure where the hook and eyes go, and then we'll be done. I've placed some hook and eyes down the front of the robe to keep the robe closed, and we are finished with our Dementor. If you want to finish off the costume with some accessories, you could take some black elbow-length gloves and a skeleton hand and just stitch that right to the top, and that might add an element of authenticity. If you enjoyed this Stash Buster project, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below, and join us next time when we do a chemise in a day. Until then, stay safe, be happy, and keep creating.